Metafiction is the concept of stories being self-aware that it is a piece of fiction. It seeks to develop a connection between the audience and the conventions of the medium. Metafiction is a common trope within comedy television shows to dissect the conventions of the work. For example, Rick and Morty is one of the most popular television shows on Adult Swim, which heavily breaks the fourth wall, where the main protagonist Rick is fully aware that he's in a television show.
Oh shit, Rick and Two Crows! Kicking off my new franchise! The galaxy is our telephone wire! We'll do 1,000 seasons, 14 episodes each, 9 seconds a pop, because that's the future of viewing!
This is done to highlight the show's absurdist elements within the conventions of an episodic television series to portray the nihilistic philosophy of the show. The concept of metafiction has its roots in mid-20th century postmodern literature, where prominent postmodern novelists such as Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut made major strides with metafictional elements that heavily rejected the modernist narrative structures of the time. These books were described as an anti-novel that refused to conform to narrative expectations. However, the term metafiction was not coined until William H. Gass described the term in his book, Fiction and the Figures of Life. Gass defines metafiction as, there are meta-theorems in mathematics and logic. Ethics has its linguistic oversoul. Everywhere lingos to converse about lingos are being contrived. And the case is no different in the novel. I don't mean merely those drearily predictable pieces about writers who are writing about what they are writing, but those, like some of the works of Borges, Barth, and Flann O'Brien, for example, in which the forms of fiction serve as the material upon which further forms can be imposed. Indeed, many of the so-called anti-novels are really metafictions. Gass describes the nature of fiction being self-aware of its own narrative structures and conventions, leading to newer forms being imposed, which can help writers develop a better understanding of the medium, leading to newer and more interesting stories being created to help the audience better understand the world around them. With this context, video games are able to include metafictional elements which help creators further understand the relationship between the audience and the medium. The most common trope in metafiction is breaking the fourth wall, where the actors on screen or in a theater talk directly to the audience. This concept involves breaking the invisible wall that divides the audience and the actors, who perform as if they cannot see the audience, while the audience can see through it.
Oh, hello.
One of the most famous examples of fourth wall breaking is utilized in Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid. The boss fight with Psycho Mantis has the antagonist able to telepathically read the player's actions until they put their controller in the Player 2 port of the PlayStation console. He also reads the player's memory card to quote,
"I can read your every thought,"
listing various games that are on the player's memory card.
So, you like Suikoden? So, you like Azure Dreams? You like Castlevania, don't you?
The player is forced to plug their controller into the second port to defeat Psycho Mantis, thus breaking the invisible wall between the virtual world and the real world. While breaking the fourth wall is a common trope in media, a piece of fiction does not need to exhibit breaking the fourth wall to be considered metafiction. A literary technique that is essential to metafictional storytelling is known as metareferences. A metareference can be described as many ideas, such as a game reference to another piece of media, a commentary on other ideas such as the production process, or a character being self-aware of the fictitious nature of the story. Meta-references are essentially the lifeblood of metafictional storytelling, as every game, regardless if they intend to be metafictional or not, will have a meta-reference of some sort. For example, Spec Ops: The Line does not include any fourth wall breaks or overtly explicit meta-elements. However, the game includes subtle meta-references to literature that inspired the game. The inclusion of the main antagonist, Conrad, a character who Walker hallucinates over the progression of the story, forcing Walker to question his sanity and morality. The meta-reference is within the name Conrad. The name is directly taken from the writer Joseph Conrad, the author of the 1899 novel Heart of Darkness, where Spec Ops functions as a loose adaptation of that novel. This meta-reference serves to remind the player of the game's inspirations, which shaped the game's dark tone and anti-war themes, therefore acting as a meta-reference to literature that inspired the game's narrative. Werner Wolf, a professor of literature at the University of Graz, Austria, describes the concept of metareference as metareferentiality can be said to denote all kinds of references to, or comments on, aspects of a medial artifact, a medium, or the media in general that issue from a logically higher meta level within a given artifact that elicits corresponding self-referential reflections in the recipient. Wolf describes these meta-references as a category of self-reference that occurs within media and video games. It includes references to and/or comments on a particular art form, genre, or the production process of media in general.
It fit the genre, so I'd use it.
These meta-references help the audience to understand the video games they consume better by dissecting the conventions of the work. By analysing the different types of meta-referencing, including metafictional literary devices such as mise en abyme and pastiche, we can apply metafictional literary theory through critically analysing 3 well-known metafictional video games. These are the Stanley Parable, Doki Doki Literature Club, and Alan Wake 2. By dissecting their meta-references, literary techniques, and deconstructing their respective genres, we can apply metafictional literary theory to video games as a medium. Werner Wolf describes different types of metafiction and reference in his book, Metareference Across Media, Theory and Case Studies. He demonstrates that there are 4 different pairs of metareferencing. These are direct and indirect, explicit and implicit, ficto versus fictum, and critical versus non-critical metareferencing. A direct metareference, also known as intracompositional metafiction, creates a reference to its own fictional nature. This means that the narrator or the creator comments on the text or video game itself. An example of direct metafiction would be Doki Doki Literature Club, as the game consistently breaks the fourth wall and addresses the audience directly to discuss the nature of dating simulators and parasocial relationships by having Monica talk directly to the audience. Indirect metareference, referred to as extracompositional metareferencing, uses references outside of the text being read, such as parodies and/or discussions on aesthetics and genres. These often reference to other artistic works to make a statement or enhance an element of the game. For example, while Signalis is not an explicitly metafictional game, creators Yuri Stern and Barbara Whitman use extracompositional meta-references to highlight the thematic weight of the game's tragic love story. While the game is not an explicitly a metafictional title, the game consistently references literary texts outside of the game. The King in Yellow, a book of short stories by Robert W. Chambers, is referred constantly in the game to highlight the idea of forbidden knowledge leading to the game's nightmare scenario, increasing the game's psychological horror elements. The meta-reference to the book is a key element of the game's lore and presentation, as it is the first and last key story item the player must pick up to progress the story. This is one example of indirect or extracompositional meta-referencing. Explicit meta-references is when the game is self-referential through direct commentary or blatant interjection in the narrative. Characters who break the fourth wall or comment on the story also engage in explicit metafiction because it compromises the game's fictionality. For example, the Stanley Parable is an explicitly metafictional game that constantly compromises the game's narrative, as the narrator is fully aware that the player is playing a video game.
You see? There's nothing here. I haven't even finished building this section of the map, because you were never supposed to be here in the first place.
Implicit meta-reference is the opposite of this. It is a meta-reference that is suggested but not directly expressed, using metaphors, references, and use of narrative techniques that examine the game itself. An example of implicit meta-reference would be in Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. The Company of Heroes subplot is one such example where a plot thread examines the genre of MMO's main story quest. This story thread forces the player avatar to undertake remedial and mundane tasks, while a much greater threat looms in the background. One of the main characters, Yustola, openly declares, "Ye gods, man, have you heard nothing I have said? We have not the time to perform trivial tasks. The enemy is at the gates," expressing frustration at the mundane tasks you are forced to undertake to progress the story. This is an implied meta-commentary on the repetitive and grindy MMO quest design philosophy that is present in the genre, which is communicated to the audience in a way that does not compromise the game's fictionality, but rather only hinting at it. Therefore, it is implicit as a meta-reference on the MMO genre rather than an explicit meta-reference. Ficto meta-referencing centers on the mediality, which is the nature of the medium, of the work. This means that while the story contains metafictional elements, it presents everything in the story as true. That means the fiction does not question the validity of the narrative. Most games that you play are often grounded in the narratives they portray, and do not make you question what you are experiencing is a narrative or work of fiction. They seek to immerse you in the worlds that you play, rather than compromise the authenticity of the story. Ficta meta-referencing, on the other hand, refers to the fictionality of the work. It is best described as openly questioning the authenticity and integrity of the narrative, undermining the truth of it and making you doubt the truthfulness of the story. Deadpool is a character widely known for his crude, meta-referential humor, as he is fully aware that he's a comic book character. The Deadpool video game is no exception to this rule, as the self-awareness of Deadpool knowing he's a video game character and is fully aware of the narrative taking place compromises the authenticity of the story. Thus, by compromising the game's fictionality, it is considered a piece of ficta meta-referencing.
Oh, did you want to go make a sandwich while the master villain stands behind me ready to strike? Oh, I'll go right ahead. We'll wait.
Finally, critical meta-referencing has the aim to find artificiality or fictional elements of a text in a critical way. This is frequently done in postmodern fiction, which seeks to contain an analysis of the work itself. An example of critical metafiction would be Spec Ops: The Line, a game that critically examines military shooters by utilizing the cliches of the genre to point out their absurdity in comparison to real warfare.
You're fucking kidding, right? That's white phosphorus.
Yeah, I know what it is.
You've seen what this shit does. You know we
We might
can't
not have
use
a
it.
choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice.
The infamous white phosphorus scene plays out with authorizing targets to shoot at, presented with a black and white infrared filter. This is a common trope in military shooters, which attempts to emulate the AC-130 Death from Above mission from Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare.
Crew, you are clear to engage, but do not fire on the church. Good kill, good kill.
By utilizing this trope, the player is forced to come to terms with the civilian deaths that they directly cause, therefore acting as a form of critical meta-referencing that aims to make the player question the reality of using war as a form of entertainment, subverting both the player's expectations and the trope itself. On the other hand, non-critical meta-referencing does not aim to critique and is based on enhancing the aesthetic experiences of the work itself without any reflective or subversive intent. The Call of Duty Zombies game mode utilizes numerous fourth wall breaks through the character of Tank Dempsey, who comments directly to the player and the game developer's Treyarch.
Hey, Treyarch, this guy's bugging me. How do I kick him from the game?
Whoever you think you're talking to, Dempsey, I don't think they're listening.
These explicit fourth wall breaks are primarily done for humorous intent to elevate the game experience rather than as a reflective statement by the developers.
Hey, player! Drop the chips and get me some ammo!
Therefore, enhancing the game experience through the use of non-critical meta-referencing. Outside of these different forms of meta-reference, there are also literary techniques that are used in metafiction to comment on art as a whole. One of these techniques is called mise en abyme, which is French for put in the abyss. It is a transmedial technique that is described as placing an image within an image, or a text within a text. One example of mise en abyme is Alan Wake 2, where the game uses an embedded narrative, or a story within a story, as the main focus of its narrative. The game illustrates mise en abyme as a metaphor to comment on the writing process and the concept of the tortured artist. Similarly, the Stanley Parable also uses mise en abyme in the original 2013 iteration of the game's main menu, acting as subtle foreshadowing to the game's extreme meta elements. Another literary device that is used in metafiction is the concept known as pastiche. Pastiche is a work that mimics the style or characteristics of another artist. It was traditionally understood as an imitation of one or more works from another creator. Modern definitions of pastiche define it as paying homage to other literary works from another artist, intending to look at the visual or artistic style from a different perspective. One example of pastiche is from the famous filmmaker Quentin Tarantino, who combines various styles and techniques from various filmmakers into his films, including shot-for-shot camera work of films that inspired him. In a 1994 interview with Empire magazine, Tarantino said that, "I steal from every single movie ever made. If my work has anything, it's that I'm taking this from this and that from that, and I'm mixing them together." Film works such as Pulp Fiction and Django Unchained use various story and camera techniques that are directly inspired by works he steals from, therefore acting as a method of pastiche to enhance the filmmaking of his movies. In this context, pastiche can also be applied in the context of video games. Signalis is one example of a game that uses pastiche, which uses meta-references to other media, including anime such as Ghost in the Shell and Neon Genesis Evangelion. These influences help consolidate its anime and thematic influences from directors such as Mamoru Oshii, the director of Ghost in the Shell, and Hideaki Anno, the director of Neon Genesis Evangelion. These influences function to form as a pastiche to shape the game's existential themes on identity and memory, therefore enhancing the game experience. All metafictional video games include these four pairs of meta-referencing to make an individual statement in their games. These important games use meta-referencing and literary devices to reinforce the themes and to make an artistic statement. The Stanley Parable uses meta-referencing to comment on player choice and freedom. Doki Doki Literature Club discusses parasocial relationships using meta-references, and Alan Wake 2 comments on the relationship between the art and the artist through various meta-elements. Each game presents a unique approach to the concept of the metafictional video game. This series of essays will dissect how these meta-references and literary devices are used to enhance the game experience of each game. The first essay will discuss the Stanley Parable, the second video will discuss Doki Doki Literature Club, and the third and final essay will discuss Alan Wake 2.